So I'm going to talk about transphobia because it's a question that's I think it's like in science we see something strange and we want an explanation, and this is something that I think it's strange, and that's Chelsea Manning. Some of you may have heard of her. Okay, so the outline, I'll talk about why I think it is a strange phenomenon from the perspective of a civil society of liberalism. And I will talk about the personal ethics, just things we do with ourselves, and to distinguish something that I think might be ignored among the differences between homosexuality and transgenderism. And then I'll talk about morality in relation to health, mental health, and what's the difference between and maybe a disease or illness and disorder. And then I'll talk about something about the politics of identity politics. So it is a civil society. I want to distinguish between need and want. So first of all, what is the question that I want an explanation for, which is, let's say, violence on the queer in general, which I would say it's whoever that's not of the heteronormative people, maybe drag queens or homosexual holding hands on the street, and even trans women, they are typically targets of violence. And I wonder why there's the hatred, because, well, in a liberal society, right, where each citizen does what they want and without infringing other citizens' human rights. I mean, you have your private life, you lead, you do what you want. Why would some people care about what others do in their private? Okay, even when they are on the street, the way they dress, but why does that got others to hate so much in order to commit violence? That's a question that I think for people in a class who are interested in LGBT issues, we won't. Uh, very, I guess almost none of us would have that kind of hatred, and that's why we won't. We need some work to understand why they are like that. So of course there are the terms homophobia and transphobia, and it's usually phrased as a kind of phobia, which is fear, and well, hatred, fear. I want to explore that more, and what I want to distinguish is, well, what I want to highlight is that homosexuality, of course, there eroticism and romance. It's simply sex and love, but usually in a very ideal situation, we have love first, right? We interact with other people as persons, and then we develop love. Could be sorority between sisterhood and fraternity and romance. But whether we want to go a step further to have sex with someone else, that's something we want to do with another person. I think that's a celebration of life, but it's not a need. It's not a need as much as eating and water. It is, of course, what contribute to a good life. But it's what we want to do with another people, and the issue about want will be more transparent later on, and transgender people will. What I'm saying is very much based on our guest speakers as well. So gender dysphoria, it's something like someone, let's say it's a trans woman, so she's psychologically a woman. She identifies with a woman, but biologically she's a male, and that's gender dysphoria. And of course, in the brackets, that's the other way around. So as that's typically put, it's a brain in a mismatching body. So the body is wrong. So of course, we want to right the bodily wrong, right? And that's different from what we want to do with another people, as in eroticism, in sex. It's something that one needs to do with oneself. So that there's that difference. And so because usually with LGBTQI community, we lump that into one thing, but I want to highlight something that's something specific to the transgender people, and the self, our selfhood, our body, of course, is part of ourself. Our body constitutes selfhood, and body parts are parts of ourselves because they're parts of our body. So what it is to hate? Let's say we hate when we have hatred towards getting what we do not want. Typically, it's not. There may be counterexamples, but let's say you're well, to use the heteronormative narrative, let's say your boyfriend gave you yellow roses on Valentine's Day, but you like red roses, and he's supposed to know that, and you might hate him for doing that as a maybe in a sissy way. I don't know, in a sassy way, maybe in many ways, but that's getting what you don't want. That's typically what gets people to hate, and there's and the kind of hatred that I guess would be in transgender people about themselves. They hate themselves for the wrong embodiment because they got a body that they didn't want. It's like they come into the world and they come into the wrong body, as they put it. It's a brain in a mismatched body. But and that's although okay, so being born into a wrong body, well, it's two situations. One is getting a sex organ that one doesn't want, that one wants not, or wanting a sex organ that one doesn't have. Although it's about sex organ, but it's not about sex. It's not about eroticism, but it's about body. And if it's about sex, one would understand that is that, oh, if it's about sex and sexual relation, sometimes some people see that as a power relation with the power dynamics. Then what about if a female wants to be a man? What about a strap-on? What about to get the I'm an artificial penis? So or maybe if you are a male but you want to be a woman, what about you just have penetrative anal sex? So you you would be a female that's dominant, and the other way around would be a male that's submissive. But that's not what transgenderism is about. Not at all. And I think that question would characterize that our body might have been wrongfully sexualized, and especially with the transgender community. It's not only about sex. It's really about the body. And if we understand how it is that there are people that just don't feel right about their body, hey, they hate themselves for having that body, but there's a difference between hating oneself with self-respect. With acceptance, with a proactive management, they ask people about that, they read about that, they see doctors, they undergo. Of course there are the periods of trial and whether to undergo surgery and hormonal treatment, but they will proactively manage their self-hatred. And on the other hand, to distinguish that from one without the kind of self-respect, maybe they escape from the issue, they don't think about that, they dwell in self-abuse, and maybe in a sad case would commit suicide. And so there's a difference between a kind of self-hatred that's with self-respect and acceptance, and the other way around. And I hypothesize that transphobics, they don't seem to themselves to be transgender, but in the end, I would try to argue something that I think will help us understand what transphobics are. Okay, so of course, when we talk about transgenderism, there's a lot of debate about whether they are sick and ill and all that. So about health and diversity, in terms of pathologizing transgenderism, I think there's a slight, very a subtle difference between mental. When we talk about mental health, you could be mentally unhealthy and mentally with a mental disorder, and these I think are two things, because let's say you have an imperfection of health, with self-respect. You could be you could be a self-respectful person without the perfection of health. You could still do better without having been unhealthy in a way that's self-abuse. So let's say physiologically, you could have a healthy lifestyle and you can do better by being more healthy, and you can have an unhealthy lifestyle. And this will be contrasted with something else later on. Because when we talk about cosmetic surgery, the legality of cosmetic surgery, let's say someone doesn't like his or her body image, maybe a small breast or a big breast, or the nose bridge is too low, and they pay and get a doctor to have cosmetic surgery. So it's more like a psychological need without being a physiological need. So they're not physiologically unhealthy, and you will see there's some, as we think more, distinguish more about these issues, we will see that there are slight differences among these things. And I would propose an immorality conception of mental illness. So it's self-respect and disrespect that distinguish mentally ill from not. And I have to characterize that better with an example later on. And the point about physiology, healthy lifestyle. We know people that are very healthy. They don't drink, they don't smoke, but they might have cancer, right? And when they have cancer, we don't just say that that person is living an unhealthy life. I think we'll say that a healthy person could get cancer as well, and disorder, which it's a physiological disintegration through entropy. It increases the disorder, chaos, and as contrasted to something that's reversible. Maybe some people would have Chinese medicine, or even a Western medicine that's restored equilibrium. Because for cancer, usually the treatment is to remove something and to with some cells, the reversibility and the irreversibility. This makes a difference. Disorder and illness makes a difference to the mind in a way that I think that we need these differences to see that transgender people, they are not abnormal in terms of humanity. They are not abnormal human. They're maybe, yeah, there's something, their defect about psychologically, mentally, or as a person, but it's not an abnormality. So that's something that I would want to argue for by distinguishing between two things. And even so, they are. If I were to categorize it, I think that's a disability, because there's some suffering in their life because they don't feel right about their body, and I would draw an analogy with congenital blindness, because typically, I think it's very under researched whether gender dysphoria is genetically, epigenetically, which interacts with the environment, or even by nurture. I think it's a very open question, but let's say it's determined very early on, and even at the fetal, when during conception, maybe. So it's an inborn disability, if it is a disability. And in terms of equity, that's something that I think even this course talks about the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations about gender equality. Although they usually talk about women and girls' rights, but I think we also have to think about transgender people. So if we think about equity in terms of equal opportunities, equality of opportunities, to think about congenital blindness, or maybe people that has to use wheelchair, we increased accessibility because they can't go upstairs, so we have lifts, escalators that they can take. So those places that were supposed to be not accessible now become accessible. So that's one way to think about equal opportunities, and that's how I think to have a healthy a body that one is satisfied with, that one doesn't have to think about, one's a body, gender dysphoria. That's also one way to think about equal opportunities, because that's how we equalize the unfairness and even inborn disability. So, but of course, then this raises something about the eugenic controversy with prenatal testing, because some people think that, okay, so blindness is a disability, then we can, with the advancement of prenatal testing, we can test whether the baby will have that inborn disability. And if it is a disability, then do the parents have a choice about whether to have that fetus? I think it will be very controversial, because yes, I think the controversial implication is that whether if a parent, if it is genetic and we find out that the fetus will be genetically with gender dysphoria, is it even moral or illegal to not have the fetus develop into the zygote develop into a fetus and a baby? That's something that, if it is a disability, there will be other things that we have to pay attention to. Then lastly, about the identity politics, and about my hypothesis. So it's about victimhood and queerness, because along that line about mental health and mental illness and the immorality conception of mental illness, let's say sympathy. When we see other people do things, we will simulate what they're doing in our mind, because there's something called, if you look up the neuroscience literature, there's something called mirror neurons. When someone else does something, it's like you do that in your mind as well. But of course, you don't do that by your behavior, but that's a very automatic way we process others' mind, and it's share our others' experience. But that's a step short from empathizing with that other person, because, well, typically when we see someone, because we're typically not psychopaths, so when we see other in pain, we will simulate others' experience, and typically we will feel with the subject. That's when we empathize with that person. So we hate with the subject that he suffered. And of course, the psychopath, they understand that others are suffering. They can simulate others' experience. They share others' pain in a way that it's exactly because of the pain that's been inflicted that they enjoy others' suffering. So you could share others' experience, but you feel against or towards. So others' negative experience, you can share that, but whether you assign a negative to it or a positive to it, like a psychopath, that's not always determined. And okay, so that's at the background, and this is not immediately applicable, but that's a research from some more than 10 years ago about homophobics, that they use the index of homophobia to distinguish two subject groups, and they measure the penile circumference increase towards homosexual stimuli. So they let them watch homosexual pornography. So those that are with higher index of homophobia, they have higher penile circumference increase. So the finding indicates that homophobia is correlated with sexual excitation towards homosexual pornographic stimuli. So this is not within the research, but it's quite clear that you have to, to put it bluntly, you have to be homosexual in order to be homophobic. If homophobia if all homophobics have sexual excitement towards homosexual pornographic materials. So I think that one way to think about homophobia is that when some typically normal heteronormative people see homosexual, that may bring out the queer in them, because when they see, let's say, when a man, someone who thinks himself to be a cis man, see two homosexual men holding hand, maybe he simulates in his mind to be holding hands with a man, and then he hates himself for feeling that way out of self-disrespect, instead of owning up to what he is, accepting himself. So that's of course not the orthodox, but that's a hypothesis based on the penile circumference increase research. So lastly, to apply that to the transphobia issue that got me thinking. So the hypothesis is very simple. So suppose, let's say, a heteronormal male or female, he or she sees a transgender, and maybe the way he or she dresses, talks, and he or she sympathizes with him or her. So it's like, in their mind, they think that's something that they mentally simulate what they're doing, the clothes they're wearing, or even the makeup they put on, or even the body that they develop, and then they hate themselves for having such an experience. Of course, to have the experience, you have to see a transgender, because, well, nowadays we read a lot about that, or us in this class we read a lot about that, but there are a lot of people that didn't. So a transgender, or maybe we go back to drag queens, which is not you could cross-dress without being a transgender. That kind of a sexual expression bring out the queer in those people that never thought about that. The typically conservative people that think they're just heteronormative and never explore their own sexuality, and they hate themselves for feeling that, for the experience that's been brought out, and that's why they hate the stimulus that brought that out. If it not for the transgender that I saw, I wouldn't have known myself to be like that, something like that. And that's the only way I can think of to explain why at all that you would just, someone's a drag queen, walk down the street, what does it have to do with you? Why would you want to beat that person up? That's the only way I can understand why that happens, and that happens a lot in the US, as documented. So in the end, transphobic people are also victims of disability, and if they learn to accept themselves and respect themselves, like those that struggled a lot, the transgender people, the very positive role model, then it's actually good not only for the victims of violence, also good for the transphobics themselves. So this is Chelsea Manning. Yeah. So here's a summary about how I, from a nowadays civil society, about liberalism, about freedom, liberties, how do people get to hate other people if you can do your own thing? Then I try to use personal ethics to distinguish between homosexuality. That's they're also the minority, but at least it's more about want than about need. And the transgender people, they're much more urgency. And then I use human morality to think about whether it's just to pathologize them in a broad brush, or whether there's some differences, subtle differences among these things. And lastly, I use that to explain hatred, transphobia. So just a reminder that he used to be a soldier on the bottom right, and then she went through a lot of things. Of course, there's something that has to do with politics, and in the end, she transitioned, and she is a proud transgender woman, and she came a long way. So